to frame this. Gokis videos, I commissioned because they provide a longitudinal case study of the web design process, and it provides a really nice summary of the design approach and touches on many of the things that we've thought about hypothetically in the lectures and in the recorded content. So he uses qualitative and quantitative analysis, including implementing quite detailed personas, and we'll think more about how these can be used in evaluation a bit later. And he also poses, I think, some interesting questions of us from a design perspective. So, for example, he asks us to think about what the affordances are of the library, the physical thing that he's trying to represent, and its contents, the rare books, and the web archive. And the way that he's responded to that has been through an online interface, a visually focused online interface. But perhaps there are ways in which you might be able to think of different ways, richer ways of expressing the physicality of the books in the archive. I also wondered if, having now you've looked through his videos, whether you felt that the archetypes that he mentioned, so work and study, personal life and leisure, which are drawn from the ways in which FutureLearn characterises users, I wondered if you'd reflected on how those compared to personas, and whether you felt that the dividing up of people into those particular roles was helpful, not only in the FutureLearn context where they're interested in learning design, but in the way that Goki applied them in terms of wider interaction design. So interaction with the additional content rather than the core learning materials of the course. Another thing I think it's worth highlighting is Goki's interest in narratives and storytelling, and in particular pathways through data and pathways through experience. This was something that Adam touched on in the UX section of the module, as did Daniel and myself. And we'll come back to this in week 10 when we think about design pathways from the perspective of game design. But this idea of narrative is at the core of Goki's approach, and it's really at the core of much HCI approaches too, as we'll see a bit later. And you'll recognise this as one example representation of the flow of users between the different sections. And this again should remind you of the discussion that Adam started in the UX videos. I think it was specifically UX 3 videos, where he's asking us to map the trajectories of users between information. And here we've got, say, a representation. This is a representation that's very similar to the ways in which Google Analytics express movement between pages. If you've done any of that yourself, it'll be familiar to you. As I say, what Goki wanted to do was link the physical resources to the digital ones. And I've already asked you, but something to reflect on more as we move into the second half of the module is how the physicality of the books could have been expressed more. So what are the different kinds of interactions that Goki could have added to the rare books interface to encourage perhaps a multi-sensory engagement with that information? He chose the cover type, the colour, the size, and the chronology, the timeline. And each of these could be expressed in very different ways. So again, I think it's perhaps worth you pausing and reflecting and perhaps sharing on the forum your views with respect to how each of these 4 components could have been represented differently. Yeah, Goki went through a variety of different options, but what are the implications of those choices? What are the different ways that these different kinds of information could be expressed? So, for example, he used I think it was the Night Labs or the simile timeline for the chronology. But there are very different ways of representing chronological information. So, for example, some of the implementations in the scalar framework that expresses time in interesting ways. But anyway, thinking about these four components, what are the ways in which you would represent the cover, the type, the colour, the size, and the chronology of these books if you were doing it yourself? So here's just an indication of these the different types: the cover, the colour, the size, and the timeline as he expressed them. In terms of how you might also reflect further on Gokis' work, I think that the way in which he refined the design process is something that you can certainly model your own practices on. So he went through in quite considerable detail the process of moving between prototypes and the proof of concept and evaluation of those. And I think you are now in a position where you could apply the same approach by prototyping using Marvel and using the paper prototyping methods you've been using in the seminars. And again, another question that I would have posed in class to you directly was whether you think that Goki needed to go into the depth in terms of the implementation as early as he did, or could more have been done by low fidelity paper prototyping perhaps, or prototyping in Marvel at a much earlier stage in order to elicit some information about some the requirements or the interactions that were most successful. Also, in thinking more broadly about the place of the kind of the movement of information within Gokis designs. When we're thinking about a particular concept moving between media, commonly we might talk about this in terms of transmedia systems. So the book, information about the book, so the cover may have been described in the Future Learn course, and then that same information will then be accessible via Gokis interface. There'll be a series of different interactions that's possible there to refine the interaction with that information, and then the user may go back to the discussion of that cover on the Future Learn course. So that concept of the cover and information about it is moving around between different interfaces. So that's a kind of a transmedia set of interactions. But what Goki identified was that there are some difficulties in navigating between these different interfaces. And so one solution to that is to be increasingly formal or consistent in the way that these interfaces are designed. And this again, I hope, reminds you of the discussion that we had around user experience again, where Daniel proposed some very different representations of information from the formal models that Adam spoke about in terms of their long design trajectory. So tropes in interaction or tropes in representation that we've become very familiar with. So, and I think that what's also interesting about this is that we're starting to see more and more people writing about design and thinking about digital interaction design in terms of deficit, in terms of us losing a lot of the kind of richness of interaction with the world through progressive, repeated systematization of this interaction. So we're hearing people talking about kind of a new analog or a return to analog, ways in which we can gain something from the kind of messiness of analog interactions with the world and use those within our digital interfaces so we get the best of both possible interactions. So this is just to support that. I mean, so these are a series of quotes that Goki pulled out in terms of the difficulty of navigating between these two sets of interaction design. The one on the Future Learn course and the one on Goki's Rare Books collection. And so similarly in your design, you should be thinking about how the different elements of your interface, so the screen, the web interface, relates to the other forms of interaction, and whether there needs to be some kind of consistent approach there, or whether you might deliberately choose for there to be almost a kind of a dissonance between the different kinds of interaction that are seen and expressed that way, and the ways in which you interact in more physical ways, perhaps with gesture. Goki also talked about or pointed towards aspects of cultural difference. And I wanted to pick up just on a couple of these. So one is his discussion of the harmony of modern and traditional, which I think is something that is particularly interesting to reflect on in the case of the Japanese case studies that he showed. And again, were we doing this face to face, my question to you would be, to what extent does his interface represent something uniquely Japanese, or has in fact the interface design drawn back from many of the Japanese design approaches that he highlighted in his videos? Also, is there a risk of stereotyping? So is there a sense in which we might choose to overlay a Japanese interaction design or representational style on an interface and lose something as a consequence of that, of it not feeling right? Goki also identified some 4 examples that I hope that you've followed up on in terms of the team lab. I think this piece of interaction design, I think, is particularly worth your following up on. This the relationships among people, so the interaction between a simulation and in this case a space with projection. So really nice example of interaction design in place. In terms of TACRAM, the second one, he identified RESAS. This is very interesting. So this is a data visualization for big data across Japan. When you look at the video and look at some of the other examples, again, I think it would be interesting for you to reflect on the extent to which a kind of a uniquely Japanese aesthetic appears to be being used or deployed there. In terms of party, this is also a wonderful piece of interaction design for spatial interaction or more choreography, in fact, of interaction. So a kind of a light installation that's encouraging a physical or multi-sensory interaction with a garden, a rooftop garden. And finally, in terms of works, this is a website associated with an exhibition about Mount Fuji, and I chose this one because again it encourages a sense of three-dimensionality and multimodality, and has a very particular I think colour aesthetic which relates closely to the design that Goki employed. So I think there are parallels in terms of the use of colour and the use of visualizations, in this case to summarise large amounts of complex information and provide a sense of the space of the real exhibition versus the virtual space, which again I think has nice parallels to the ways in which Goki has been trying to instantiate something physical, the real books and the real library, or libraries where you can visit them, through the digital means of the Rare Books collection. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, reflecting back on Goki's talk. In the next one, I'll go a bit deeper and think specifically about user requirements.